A rich man fired a single mother. Then karma teaches him a lesson. Robert Aldridge was a man whose name carried weight in every corner of Crescent Falls, the bustling city he called home. Tall, impeccably dressed, and perpetually exuding an air of quiet authority, he was the epitome of success in the eyes of many. He owned several businesses throughout the city, everything from high-end restaurants to luxury retail boutiques. But his crowning jewel was Aldridge Enterprises, a consulting firm that specialized in streamlining operations for large corporations. Over the years, Robert's relentless drive, combined with a laser focus on the bottom line, had propelled him to an enviable status. Wealthy, influential, and respected by those who admired the traditional markers of success. Yet, beneath the polish of his tailored suits and immaculate office, a less flattering truth festered. He was a man short on compassion and quick to discard anyone he deemed unproductive. No one knew that better than the employees who worked on the 15th floor of the Aldridge Enterprises building. The floor housed the administrative staff and junior consultants, people who scurried about daily, preparing reports, scheduling meetings, and doing the countless minor tasks that allowed Robert to keep his demanding schedule. Among these staff members was Elena Fisher, a hard-working single mother in her early 30s. She was relatively new to the company, having joined just under a year ago as an administrative assistant for a mid-level project manager. Though entry-level, her position was crucial. She handled scheduling, budget tracking, and the day-to-day organizational needs that kept projects running smoothly. Elena's life had never been simple. She had grown up in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Crescent Falls, where resources were limited and opportunities could be scarce. She became pregnant in her early 20s, and though initially she tried to make it work with her child's father, circumstances fell apart shortly after her daughter Lily was born. Facing life as a single mother, Elena poured all her energy into doing whatever it took to raise Lily with stability and love. She moved in with her elderly aunt for a time, juggled multiple part-time jobs, and eventually put herself through a vocational program in administrative management. Aldridge Enterprises was her first big break into the corporate world, an office job with a predictable paycheck, health benefits, and some hope for advancement. She worked tirelessly to keep up with the demands of her new role, often arriving early and staying late. Because Lily was still in elementary school, Elena had to manage drop-offs, pickups, and after-school care, a logistical puzzle that required constant juggling of schedules. Yet she rarely complained. She came into the office with a smile, diligently completed her tasks, and helped her colleagues whenever she could. Over time, her warmth and work ethic won her a few friends among the staff. But Elena's dedication wasn't universally admired. Robert Aldridge himself seldom acknowledged her. She was invisible to him, just another anonymous worker in a sea of cubicles, until the day she appeared on his radar for the wrong reasons. It began subtly. A project manager reported that Elena, for the first time in her nearly year-long tenure, had missed a budget update. The manager, Sharon, covered for Elena in the meeting, citing a glitch in the software. In truth, Elena's aunt had suffered a mild stroke that week, forcing Elena to scramble for emergency childcare, handle hospital visits, and juggle more than usual. One overlooked report in a sea of otherwise flawless performance might have been easily forgiven, but Robert Aldridge was not known for leniency. Robert's methodical mind was perpetually scanning for inefficiencies. He believed in a ruthless approach. If something or someone did not yield maximum output, it was a liability. So when Sharon's project started to lag by a day or two, Robert didn't hesitate to question every aspect of the team's performance. He hovered in the office more frequently, stepping out of his corner, sweet to peruse the staff's activities. It was a tense atmosphere on the 15th floor, like walking on eggshells. People could feel his presence before they even saw him, that simmering dissatisfaction emanating from behind his calm but critical gaze. Elena felt the pressure acutely. She took files home, worked past midnight to ensure no detail was missed, and tried to keep her personal life from interfering. But just as she was regaining her footing, her aunt stabilized, Lily was back in school, Lily fell ill with a high fever. It was the kind of daily crisis so common to single parents, but it struck at the worst possible time. Elena tried to make arrangements, calling a babysitter and neighbors, desperately seeking a solution. Ultimately, Lily needed a trip to urgent care and bed rest. So Elena called in sick for half a day, emailing Sharon that she would finish her tasks from home. Robert noticed. He was meeting with Sharon that morning when she mentioned Elena's absence. It was a passing remark. Sharon's intention was simply to keep Robert informed, but it triggered his suspicion. The missed budget update, the half-day absence. Robert saw a pattern. He asked pointedly, "Is this person truly committed to the success of this company?" Sharon tried to defend Elena, praising her work ethic under normal circumstances. But Robert's mind had latched onto the negative. He saw Elena as an underperforming cog in the machine, someone who couldn't balance her personal life with company demands. And, to him, that was enough to draw a grim conclusion. A few days later, Lily recovered, and Elena returned to the office. She had no inkling of what was to come. She believed that her long hours and consistent performance would overshadow the few inevitable hiccups life had thrown at her. But Robert Aldridge had already made up his mind. In a staff-wide email, he announced a reorganization to improve efficiency. Several positions would be consolidated, including Elena's. Though other staff also faced cuts, Elena was singled out for an immediate termination to streamline administrative tasks. The news hit like a thunderbolt. Elena was at her desk, powering through data entry, when Sharon approached with downcast eyes. "Elena, I'm so sorry," she began, voice trembling. "Robert wants to see you in his office." Elena's stomach churned with dread. She stood, smoothed out her blouse, and followed Sharon across the floor. The hush that fell over the cubicles was deafening. People shot her sympathetic glances, and a pit formed in her gut as she realized how dire this meeting might be. When she stepped into Robert's office, the opulent surroundings felt suffocating. Plush carpets, a wall of windows overlooking the city skyline, and a massive mahogany desk behind which Robert sat, arms folded, expression stern. He gestured for her to close the door. Clearing his throat, Robert launched into a clinical explanation of the firm's new direction. He spoke of overhead, synergy, and performance optimization, weaving corporate buzzwords into a hollow tapestry that was supposed to justify letting her go. Elena, stunned, tried to form words, but her throat seemed to close. Through the haze, she managed to stutter. "But my performance reports have been good. I've never had a formal warning." His steely gaze bore into her. "We've had to make tough choices," he said without a trace of empathy. "You're not the only one affected. We're giving you 2 weeks severance, which is more than required by law. Please see HR for the paperwork." Tears threatened to sting Elena's eyes. She blinked rapidly to keep them at bay. "Mr. Aldridge, she paused, swallowing a sob. She had to gather her strength. "I'm a single mother. I depend on this job. If there's anything I can do, work part-time, shift departments." His face remained impassive, betraying not a flicker of compassion. "I'm sorry," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "This decision is final." Sharon placed a comforting hand on Elena's shoulder, guiding her out of the room. Elena's head swirled with worry. How would she pay rent? What about Lily's daycare fees? She tried to remain dignified as she packed up the personal items from her desk. A framed photo of Lily, a small potted plant, and a few office supplies. Co-workers whispered words of consolation, some openly outraged. But no one dared challenge Robert's directive. Walking out of Aldridge Enterprises, that day felt surreal. The city lights glimmered in the late afternoon, 1,000 windows reflecting the sun. Elena paused outside the revolving doors, hugging the cardboard box of her possessions to her chest. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. She felt uprooted, uncertain, and alone, yet she refused to break down on the crowded sidewalk. She went home, placed the box on her kitchen counter, and stared at Lily's smiling face in the photo frame. That's who she was doing this for. She had to be strong. In the days that followed, Elena's life unraveled in slow motion. She had enough savings to cover rent for a month, maybe two if she lived frugally. She applied for countless positions, from small businesses to bigger corporations, but rarely heard back. Competition was fierce. Night after night, she pored over job postings online, updating her resume, customizing cover letters. She also started looking for side gigs, anything to keep the lights on, babysitting, data entry from home, tutoring. She was determined to persevere. Meanwhile, Robert Aldridge's life rolled on smoothly, or so it seemed. He hardly registered the staff changes he had instituted, focused instead on a major deal with an international client. For him, the path was straightforward. Maintain efficiency, grow profits, project an image of unstoppable success. He'd already lined up a series of high-stakes meetings, pitched new strategies to global partners, and boasted to the press about Aldridge Enterprises' forward-thinking approach. He paid no thought to the people left behind. But karma, as the old saying goes, has a patient sense of timing, and cracks began to appear in Robert's carefully curated world. It started with an internal audit that revealed a glaring oversight in how one of the newly consolidated teams managed their data. Because Elena was no longer there to handle administrative checks, certain invoices went unpaid, some client records were misfiled. A minor scandal flared when an important invoice was months overdue, prompting threats of legal action. Panicked junior staff scrambled to fix the mess, but the damage was done. A client that had always trusted Aldridge Enterprises began to question their professionalism. Robert responded with anger, blaming middle managers for the slip-ups and holding emergency meetings to identify the root cause. He pounded his fist on the table, demanded accountability, and threatened further layoffs if things didn't improve. Tension soared. Long-time employees quietly resented his heavy-handed tactics. Morale plummeted. Yet in Robert's eyes, these complications were just minor setbacks, easily addressed by being tougher on staff. A more significant blow struck when a major investor, alarmed by the negative press from the mishandled invoices, decided to pull funding for a partnership deal. Robert had banked on that investment to expand into a new consulting niche. Suddenly, the expansion was on hold, and Robert had to scramble for alternative capital. Frustrated, he found himself spending more and more time trying to patch holes in a ship he thought was unsinkable. All the while, Elena's daily grind became more desperate. As her savings dwindled, she picked up odd jobs to sustain herself and Lily. She cleaned offices in the early mornings, babysat in the afternoons, and did data entry from home whenever Lily was asleep. Exhaustion was a constant companion, dark circles under her eyes a testament to nights of minimal rest. Lily, sensing her mother's stress, tried to be on her best behavior. But even at 8 years old, the child worried. On one particularly hard evening, Elena found Lily quietly crying in her bedroom. "I'm sorry I got sick," Lily whispered. "Is that why you lost your job?" Elena's heart shattered. She cradled her daughter in her arms. "No, sweetheart, it's not your fault," she managed, voice trembling. "Never ever think that. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." Financial pressures mounted. Late notices for rent started stacking up. Elena's landlord, a stern woman with little empathy for personal hardships, threatened eviction if Elena couldn't make a payment within the next 2 weeks. And the job market in Crescent Falls, once flush with opportunities, seemed to have dried up overnight, at least for someone with limited experience and constraints like childcare. Feeling cornered, Elena swallowed her pride and considered requesting assistance from the local job placement center. She also visited a small nonprofit that helped single parents find stable work. On a crisp fall morning, She waited in a long line at the organization's modest office, eventually meeting a caseworker who gave her a list of job leads. None promised immediate relief, but it was a glimmer of hope. Unbeknownst to Elena, her name had started circulating among the staff who had left or been laid off from Aldridge Enterprises. Word was they were forming a small group to explore a legal challenge against the company. The group alleged that certain layoffs had been arbitrary, possibly violating workers' rights. Though Elena was initially approached to join them, she felt she had no energy for a legal battle. She wanted to move on, not be bogged down in court cases. She wasn't looking for revenge, just the chance to provide for her daughter. Still, her firing and the subsequent events did not go unnoticed. A local journalist, assigned to cover corporate layoffs in Crescent Falls, stumbled upon Elena's story. He'd already been tracking Robert Aldridge's firm due to mounting reports of internal strife. When he heard about a single mother abruptly terminated despite a solid performance record, he saw a human angle, something that could illustrate the larger issue of ruthless corporate downsizing. He managed to track Elena down through a mutual acquaintance. When he called her, politely asking for an interview, Elena hesitated. She was uncomfortable with public attention and feared burning bridges in the corporate world. But the journalist persisted gently, explaining he wanted to shed light on real people affected by these layoffs. After wrestling with her fears, Elena agreed to speak with him anonymously, on condition that her face and last name remain undisclosed to protect her future job prospects. The resulting piece was published online under the title Lives in the Crossfire: How Ruthless Downsizing Affects Real Families. Though it did not name Aldridge Enterprises outright, it contained enough details for anyone familiar with the story to connect the dots. The piece gained modest traction on social media, accompanied by comments criticizing the cold calculus of corporate giants. Elena's phone buzzed with messages from friends who suspected the article was about her, offering words of sympathy. Robert Aldridge, engrossed in damage control over lost investors, initially overlooked the article. But eventually, it landed on the desk of one of his public relations consultants, who flagged it as a PR risk. Robert read it with growing annoyance, though his name wasn't mentioned. The references to a single mother unexpectedly fired by a large consulting firm in Crescent Falls struck too close to home. He was livid at the potential negative publicity. One evening, after a long day of putting out figurative fires at the office, Robert arrived at his opulent penthouse apartment with frustration rippling through him. He threw his leather briefcase onto the couch, sank into a designer chair, and ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair. The swirling thoughts in his mind were no longer just about profit and loss. For the first time in a long while, he felt something akin to an uneasy conscience. Or maybe it was just the fear of bad press. He wasn't quite sure. Maybe we should have given that single mother more time, he muttered to himself, quickly adding, No, that's an emotional reaction. Business is business. He recalled a childhood memory, an odd flash that he usually buried. His own father laid off from a factory job, coming home in tears one day, the family's future uncertain. It was a memory Robert seldom allowed to surface because it contradicted the persona he had built, someone impervious, unaffected by vulnerability. He shook his head, trying to dispel that recollection. In the ensuing weeks, Robert's stress escalated. The client lost due to the mishandled invoices decided to go public with their complaints about Aldridge Enterprises' unprofessional conduct. The local press latched onto the story, linking it with rumors of staff dissatisfaction. Investors and partners grew wary. Robert found himself scrambling to schedule meetings, phone calls, and PR strategies to contain the fallout. His days, once neatly structured, devolved into a chaotic scramble to uphold his firm's reputation. At night, even in the lavish comfort of his penthouse, sleep eluded him. He'd rise at odd hours, glance at the city skyline, and pace his living room with a glass of water or scotch in hand. The city had lost its glitter in his eyes, replaced by swirling anxieties about losing everything he'd built. For a man who had always prided himself on control, the creeping sensation of vulnerability was a bitter pill to swallow. Meanwhile, Elena's predicament worsened. The landlord's ultimatum was looming, and her best option was a low-paying administrative role at a warehouse across town. The commute would be nearly an hour each way by public transportation, but she had little choice. She needed a steady paycheck. She accepted the job, swallowing her disappointment at the meager salary. In her new role, she spent hours processing inventory data in a poorly lit back office, surrounded by the sound of forklifts and the smell of cardboard. It was far from the professional environment she'd hoped to remain in, but it kept a roof over Lily's head. One dreary winter morning, Elena was on her way to the warehouse when she felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. She was already running late, having missed her usual bus, and answered anxiously, fearing bad news. Instead, she heard the cheerful voice of the caseworker from the nonprofit she had visited weeks ago. "We have an opening at a medium-sized marketing company," the caseworker said. "They need a capable administrative manager. The pay is significantly better, and they're open to flexible hours. I recommended you, and they'd like to interview you tomorrow if possible." Elena almost dropped her phone in disbelief. She quickly thanked the caseworker. After hanging up, she stared at the drizzling rain from the bus window, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. Maybe her fortunes were turning. Maybe she and Lily wouldn't have to live in constant fear of eviction. The next day, Elena took an early lunch break from the warehouse job to attend the interview. Nervous but determined, she put on her best blazer and arrived at the modest offices of Townsend Marketing. A friendly HR representative greeted her, and the interview process, though rigorous, felt oddly comfortable. They asked about her past experiences, her organizational skills, how she handled deadlines under pressure. She answered honestly, weaving in examples of her meticulous work at Aldridge Enterprises and how she had juggled her responsibilities as a single mother. The interviewers seemed impressed. A few days later, they offered her the position. The salary was decent, the hours manageable, and Townsend Marketing had a small daycare partnership that could be a lifesaver during emergencies. Overwhelmed with relief, Elena accepted on the spot. She gave her 2 weeks' notice at the warehouse, just as the landlord was about to demand rent, and with her final paycheck plus a small loan from the nonprofit's emergency fund, she covered her outstanding bills. Moving into her new role at Townsend Marketing was like stepping into fresh air after being trapped in a stale room. The atmosphere was warm, the management supportive, and her direct supervisor took the time to mentor her. She felt valued, not disposable. She threw herself into her tasks, managing event logistics, coordinating schedules for the marketing team, and streamlining administrative processes. Her colleagues admired her efficiency, and within a few weeks, Elena felt she was finally on solid ground again. During this period, Robert Aldridge's struggles intensified. A second major investor pulled out. Speculative rumors hinted at deeper internal problems in Aldridge Enterprises. Allegations that it was hemorrhaging talent and morale. Clients grew cautious. Some delayed signing new contracts. The negative momentum started to feed on itself, transforming from small leaks into a full-blown crisis. Robert found himself in near-constant meetings with bankers, lawyers, and PR consultants, trying to patch the sinking ship. In a twist of fate, Townsend Marketing heard rumors that Aldridge Enterprises might be selling off a portion of its consulting services. Townsend's CEO sensed an opportunity, suspecting that if Aldridge Enterprises was desperate, they might be willing to sell at a discount. Townsend Marketing had been looking to expand, and acquiring a smaller consulting branch from a once great competitor could be a strategic move, if executed correctly. When Elena learned about Townsend's interest in Aldridge Enterprises, a flutter of anxiety passed through her. Memories of her humiliating termination lingered, and the thought of interacting with that company again sent a chill down her spine. Yet she also felt a strange sense of empowerment in her new environment. Here, she had colleagues who valued her input, and her role placed her close to decision-makers. She occasionally sat in on higher-level meetings to take notes. If Townsend indeed pursued negotiations with Aldridge Enterprises, she might very well be in the room. Sure enough, a few weeks later, an internal memo confirmed that Townsend Marketing was setting up a meeting with Aldridge Enterprises leadership to explore a potential acquisition of one of their smaller consulting departments. Elena's heart pounded when she realized the meeting was scheduled at her new office. She would be responsible for organizing the logistics, conference rooms, catering, schedules. She might even be called to take minutes during the talks. Could it be possible she'd have to face Robert Aldridge again? She wrestled with conflicting emotions. Fear of seeing the man who'd callously fired her, but also an emerging sense of quiet resolve. This time, she wouldn't be powerless. On the day of the scheduled meeting, Townsend's senior executives huddled in a large conference room. Elena arrived early, setting out carafes of coffee, arranging pastries, and ensuring the projector and laptops were in working order. Her nerves sparkled with adrenaline. She wore a calm exterior, but her thoughts whirled. Would Robert be present, or would he send representatives? How would he react upon seeing her in this position? The moment came just after 9 a.m. A small delegation from Aldridge Enterprises arrived, stepping off the elevator with measured confidence. Elena recognized two of them as mid-level directors she had seen in passing. They looked tired, as though the stress of the company's troubles weighed on them. And there, at the rear, walked Robert Aldridge in the flesh. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, posture straight, gaze scanning the hall like a man entering a foreign territory. Elena felt her pulse race, but forced herself to maintain composure. "Welcome to Townsend Marketing," she said politely, greeting each visitor. When she extended her hand to Robert, his expression wavered. For a second, he seemed not to recognize her. Then, as realization dawned, his lips parted slightly, eyes widening. "Elena Fisher," he said in a low voice, the name coming to him with awkward slowness. She nodded. "Yes, Mr. Aldridge. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to the conference room." He swallowed hard, a hint of discomfort flickering across his face before he regained composure. The group followed her, and Elena could sense Robert's gaze drifting her way periodically, as though he couldn't quite process the fact that she was employed here, and apparently thriving. She guided them into the spacious conference room, introduced them to Townsend's executives, then took a seat near the back to manage the projector and record notes. Throughout the meeting, Robert seemed distracted, fumbling over details he would normally deliver with smooth precision. The Townsend executives, meanwhile, appeared well prepared, asking incisive questions about the department's assets, revenue streams, and liabilities. Elena recorded every point diligently, occasionally glancing up to see Robert's jaw tightening whenever Townsend's negotiators pressed for lower buy-in costs. At one point, Townsend's CEO, a sharp-witted woman named Evelyn Grant, turned the conversation toward the cultural atmosphere of Aldridge Enterprises. "Given some of the recent press about layoffs and staff morale, we want reassurance that the employees in the department we might acquire are stable and motivated." Robert forced a tight smile. "We've had some restructuring, but our teams remain highly committed." The press exaggerated certain stories, as the press often does. Elena kept her eyes on her notepad, forcing herself not to react. She remembered vividly the day he'd fired her with minimal concern for her personal circumstances. She recalled how restructuring had shattered her life, but she kept her composure. The talks continued well into the afternoon. By the time they broke for lunch, Robert looked unsettled. He was losing ground in the negotiations. Townsend had leverage, and they knew it. Elena stepped out briefly to confirm catering arrangements, then returned to find Robert alone near the window, gazing at the city skyline. She cleared her throat softly. He turned around. For a moment, they just stood there, the hum of the building's air conditioning filling the silence. Finally, Robert spoke. "I had no idea you worked here. How long have you been?" "A few months," Elena replied evenly, crossing her arms. She refused to shrink under his scrutiny. He nodded, lips pursed. "It seems you landed on your feet," he observed, though the words carried a grudging undertone. Elena lifted her chin. "I had help and I worked hard," she said matter-of-factly. She could have added how harshly he had tossed her aside, but she refrained. Instead, she let the silence speak volumes. Robert ran a hand through his hair, a subtle sign of discomfort. He glanced around, ensuring no one else was within earshot. "Elena," he began, his voice quieter, "I realize our meeting here is unexpected. I want you to know that the decision to terminate certain positions at Aldridge Enterprises was never personal." She felt a flicker of anger. He was apologizing, but not apologizing. "Maybe not personal," she replied, tone steady, "but it felt personal to me. I'm a single mother, Mr. Aldridge. Being fired without warning nearly cost me my home. It certainly cost me my peace of mind." He exhaled, looking momentarily chastened. "I'm sorry about that. Truly," he said, though the phrase was halting, as if he wasn't used to uttering those words. "I had a responsibility to the company's bottom line." Elena let the quiet settle between them again. She could see something shifting in Robert, perhaps an internal battle between his pride and his conscience. Then she decided to release him from the moment. "Let's get back to the negotiations. I'm sure Townsend is eager to finalize details." She turned and walked away, leaving him to stand alone, the weight of his unspoken guilt lingering in the air. After lunch, the second round of talks resumed. Elena continued to take notes, noticing how Robert seemed more cautious, less assertive. Townsend's team capitalized on that, pressing for a favorable deal. By the end of the day, both sides agreed to continue negotiations in a week's time, with Townsend finalizing their offer. The Aldridge team departed with forced smiles and terse goodbyes, Robert trailing behind. As he passed Elena, he paused, gave a curt nod, and left. Word spread quickly through Townsend marketing that Elena had once worked for Aldridge Enterprises, that she had been laid off by Robert Aldridge himself. People offered her sympathetic smiles or curious glances. Some patted her on the back, praising her professionalism during the meeting. Elena tried to take it all in stride. She was just grateful to be where she was now, valued for her contributions. Over the following week, Elena wrestled with a swirl of emotions. A part of her felt vindicated, watching Robert grovel to secure a deal he desperately needed. Another part felt uneasy, sensing how much stress he must be under. She couldn't bring herself to celebrate someone else's downfall, not even the man who had so casually fired her. Life had taught her to be cautious about harboring bitterness. Negativity had a way of poisoning one's own spirit. When the next meeting rolled around, Townsend's executives announced that they had no interest in absorbing the entire department, only specific elements and key personnel. This took the Aldridge team by surprise. Robert bristled at what he perceived as cherry-picking. Townsend wanted the cream of the crop, skilled consultants, existing client contracts, while leaving the less profitable segments behind. The tension in the room was palpable. Townsend's CEO laid out the ultimatum. They would only consider a deal if Aldridge Enterprises agreed to a drastically reduced sale price and negotiated severance packages for staff who wouldn't be transferring. It was a tough stance, one that signaled Townsend's leverage. Robert's face tightened. He tried to muster a confident smile. "We'll have to discuss this internally," he said. "We can't make a decision today." Townsend's CEO nodded, unyielding. "That's fine. We're prepared to move quickly on our end if you agree. But if you need more time, we understand. Just know we have other opportunities in the pipeline. A flicker of frustration passed across Robert's features. He knew it was a thinly veiled warning. Townsend wouldn't wait forever. After the meeting adjourned, Elena lingered in the conference room to pack up. Robert slipped back in, presumably having doubled back from the elevators. He closed the door behind him. "Elena," he began, his voice quieter now, "I'm in a difficult position. I know you have no obligation to help me, but I wanted to ask if there's any chance you could put in a good word with Townsend's executives. They seem to value your input." She placed a stack of papers on the table, turning to face him. "You want me to intervene on your behalf?" He exhaled, the slightest flush on his cheeks. Not intervene, exactly, but a favorable word about our culture, our staff. It might help offset the negative press and ensure the deal isn't entirely one-sided. Elena studied him, recalling the day he'd fired her without a second thought. Here he was now, essentially asking for her compassion. She bit her lower lip, her mind swirling with conflicting impulses. "I'm not sure how I feel about that," she replied finally. "I do have the ear of some decision-makers here, but I can in good conscience tell them Aldridge Enterprises has a supportive, nurturing culture, when that wasn't my experience." He grimaced. "I understand. Perhaps you could mention that I regret certain actions and am committed to improving." She cocked her head. "Are you really?" The question hung in the air. Robert looked away, swallowing. "I fired you without thinking about the human side of the equation. I convinced myself it was just business. But seeing you here, thriving, successful, has forced me to reevaluate. My company is in trouble, Elena. But it might be the wake-up call I needed. I won't pretend I've changed overnight, but I see now that people are more than line items on a budget." Elena felt a knot of emotion in her chest. She thought of Lily, of those frantic nights working odd jobs. She also thought of how, just a few months ago, a single gesture of understanding from Robert could have saved her from such hardship. Was it her responsibility to help him now? Could she extend empathy to the very man who had shown her so little? She searched his eyes, looking for sincerity, and saw, at least, genuine desperation. The old version of herself might have closed her heart to him, but Elena had always been guided by compassion. That was why she'd survived so many storms. "I'll tell them the truth," she said. "I'll say that when I worked for Aldridge Enterprises, I learned a lot, and that some parts of the culture were indeed efficient. But if they ask about staff morale or how people were treated, I won't lie. I won't fabricate a glowing review." Robert nodded slowly, seeming relieved and disappointed at the same time. "Thank you," he managed. "I suppose that's all I can ask for." Word about Elena's conversation with Robert spread quietly among the Townsend managers after she disclosed it. Though she wasn't a top executive, her perspective carried weight because she had first-hand experience with Aldridge Enterprises. When Townsend CEO Evelyn Grant asked Elena for her honest take on whether the acquisition was worth it, Elena emphasized that many of the consultants were skilled, but the culture under Robert Aldridge had historically been cutthroat. She suggested that if Townsend acquired certain teams, they should integrate them carefully under Townsend's more humane approach. Those words resonated with Evelyn. She recognized the potential synergy. Keep the talent, discard the toxic elements. A few days later, Townsend submitted their final offer to Aldridge Enterprises. The price was even lower than initially discussed, reflecting the risky nature of the acquisition. But Townsend promised to retain and transition as many employees as possible under its own management style, providing them with a supportive environment. Robert found himself with no real choice. His company was hemorrhaging money, and investor confidence was at an all-time low. Reluctantly, He accepted Townsend's terms. The deal was signed one crisp winter afternoon, with Robert and Evelyn shaking hands in a subdued ceremony. Elena stood by, taking notes, feeling a strange blend of triumph and empathy. In the aftermath, Robert quietly slipped out of the building. There were no warm farewells, no parting celebrations. He retreated to his penthouse, wrestling with the reality that he had sold off a key part of his empire at a fraction of its previous value. The man who had once believed himself invincible now confronted the humbling truth that mistakes in leadership and a lack of compassion could come back to haunt you. In the weeks that followed, Townsend worked diligently to onboard the newly acquired staff. Elena played a role in orienting them, organizing training sessions, and ensuring they felt welcome. Occasionally, she recognized a face from her old life, someone who would do a double take upon seeing her. Some apologized for not standing up when she was fired. Others simply looked relieved that they, too, had a second chance. As winter edged into spring, Elena settled into a life that felt almost peaceful compared to the chaos she had endured. Lily was thriving in school, enjoying a more stable routine now that her mother had regular hours. They'd been able to pay the bills on time and even set aside a small emergency fund. On weekends, they sometimes strolled through the neighborhood park, Lily racing around the playground while Elena watched from a nearby bench, feeling grateful for every small joy. One Saturday morning, after finishing her grocery shopping, Elena stepped outside the store to find an unexpected scene. Parked at the curb was an older sedan with a hood propped open, steam pouring out. A man stood there, peering anxiously into the engine compartment. It was Robert Aldridge. Gone was the tailored suit and the aura of unshakable confidence. He wore a simple jacket and slacks, and when he turned around, Elena saw weariness etched into his features. She hesitated. Their last interaction had ended on a note of cautious politeness. Part of her wanted to turn away, to avoid the awkwardness. But something held her there, the memory of her own struggles, the knowledge that compassion sometimes came from unexpected places. Setting her grocery bags down, she approached him. "Car troubles?" she asked gently. Robert started, nearly dropping the dipstick he was holding. He blinked at Elena. "The engine's overheating," he muttered, taking a step back so she could see the rising steam. "I think a hose might have burst. I was on my way to a job meeting." She nodded, remembering that his empire had shrunk significantly and he was likely hunting for new opportunities, or maybe patching the remnants of his existing businesses. "Do you have anyone you can call?" "A towing service." He sighed. "I canceled my premium auto club membership a few weeks ago. Cost cutting." The corners of his mouth twisted in ironic frustration. Elena glanced at her watch. Lily was waiting for her at a friend's house. She had some time before she needed to pick her up. "Let me see if I can help," she offered. He seemed caught off guard by her willingness. In the past, he had parted ways with employees by focusing on business necessity, not personal connection. Yet here she was, offering assistance. He stepped aside as she poked at the radiator cap carefully. Though she wasn't exactly a mechanic, she knew the basics of what to look for, thanks to her father teaching her years ago. Sure enough, a small hose near the radiator had cracked, leaking coolant. "You won't get far like this," Elena said. "There's an auto parts store a couple blocks down. I can drive you there to pick up a replacement hose, if that's all it is." Robert hesitated, pride warring with practicality. He glanced at the pale green fluid dripping onto the pavement. "All right," he said eventually, exhaling. "Thank you." They loaded his briefcase into the trunk of Elena's modest sedan and drove to the auto parts store. On the way, conversation felt strained. Robert cleared his throat a few times, as though on the verge of saying something, but remained silent. Elena focused on the road, trying not to dwell on the irony of the situation. Inside the store, Robert purchased a replacement hose and some coolant. Back at his stalled sedan, he rolled up his sleeves. With Elena holding a flashlight and the instruction manual from the new hose, they managed to secure the replacement part. It was a messy, time-consuming process, especially since the engine was still hot. But eventually, they succeeded. Robert poured the coolant, wiped his hands on a rag, and tested the ignition. The car started, and though it still gave a ragged cough, the steam subsided. "Thank you," Robert said, turning the engine off again. He leaned against the car's fender, staring at the ground. "I know you had no obligation to help me. Not after everything." Elena put the flashlight down, massaging a kink in her neck. "I helped because you needed it," she said simply. "That's all." His eyes flicked to hers. "I've been learning some hard lessons lately. The business is, well, it's not what it once was. I lost investor confidence, had to sell off key departments. Lenders want me to restructure. It's a mess. And I keep thinking," he paused, swallowing, "if I'd spent more time valuing people, not just profits, maybe it wouldn't have come to this." Elena listened, absorbing the vulnerability in his tone. She recalled the day she walked out of Aldridge Enterprises, cardboard box in her arms, tears burning her cheeks. She couldn't help but feel compassion now, seeing how the once mighty had fallen. "People make mistakes," she replied carefully. "It's what we do after that counts." He glanced away, eyes moist. "I'm trying to fix what I can, but there's so much damage." A wave of emotions washed over Elena: pity, empathy, and a bittersweet sense of justice. Karma had, in its slow way, taught Robert Aldridge a lesson, pulling him from the heights of his empire to a place where he needed help from someone he had once discarded. She felt no triumph in his suffering, only a sober reminder that fortunes could change for anyone at any time. "You can start by treating people better in the future," she said gently. "That includes yourself. You don't have to keep punishing yourself for past choices, but you do need to learn from them." Robert nodded, letting her words sink in. A faint smile touched his lips, sad but grateful. "Thank you, Elena," he repeated. "I owe you more than just a repaired radiator hose." She gave a slight nod. "We'll call it even," she said, "on one condition: if you ever get back on your feet, remember what it feels like to be vulnerable. And use your position to help, not hurt." His gaze flickered with a renewed sense of purpose. "I promise." With that, Elena packed up her things, reminded him to drive slowly to let the engine settle, and said her goodbye. As she pulled away, she saw him in her rear-view mirror, standing by his sputtering sedan, shoulders visibly lighter than before. She didn't know what path lay ahead for him, if he'd rebuild his business or pursue another venture. But she left that parking lot certain that a spark of change had ignited within him, kindled by humility and the empathy he had so long resisted. A few days later, Elena received a surprise package delivered to her desk at Townsend Marketing. It was a small box wrapped in plain brown paper, with a handwritten note on top. Recognizing Robert's name in the return address, she opened it carefully. Inside was a letter and a simple silver keychain shaped like a gear. The letter read in part: Elena, I'm not sure how else to express my gratitude. Thank you for reminding me that people matter. This keychain belonged to my father. He used to say that each gear in a machine must be treated with care, or the whole system breaks down. I never truly understood that until recently. I'd like you to have it, as a small reminder of how important every person is, no matter their role. Sincerely, Robert Aldridge. Elena ran her fingertips over the metal gear, reflecting on the symbolism. She tucked the keychain into her pocket, touched by the sincerity of the gesture. Perhaps Robert was beginning a new chapter, one where compassion and respect played a bigger role. In the end, Elena's story wasn't one of gleeful revenge or triumphant schadenfreude. It was a quiet tale of resilience and the power of empathy. She had faced her share of hardships, losing her job, nearly losing her home, and fighting to rebuild her life. Yet she had emerged stronger, not hardened by bitterness. And Robert Aldrich, once a paragon of ruthless ambition, had been confronted with the consequences of his own callous decisions. In that confrontation, he discovered a humanity he'd long suppressed, learning that success without compassion is fragile indeed. For Elena and Lily, life continued to improve at Townsend Marketing. They found stability and even the seed of future dreams, a chance to plan for Lily's college fund, maybe to move into a safer neighborhood. Elena grew into her role, eventually being promoted to a senior administrative coordinator, managing an entire team. She carried the memory of her struggles as a reminder never to take her good fortune for granted. And whenever she reached a position to hire new staff or mentor junior employees, she did so with the grace and understanding she had yearned for in her darkest days.